At 06:15 hours on August 21, 1942, Colonel Ichiki stood at the edge of a humid coconut grove on the island of Guadalcanal, peering through the gloom across a stagnant, shallow body of water known as Alligator Creek toward the American defensive line he was about to attack. Behind him stood the first echelon of the 28th Infantry Regiment, 917 of Japan's finest soldiers who had trained for years in the harsh climate of Manchuria and the killing fields of China. These were men who had swept across Asia, conquering territory after territory without a single significant defeat, and they believed with absolute certainty that no Western force could stand against them in close combat. The Americans digging into the sand on the other side of that creek were United States Marines, men that Ichiki had studied in pre-war intelligence reports which described them as soft, undisciplined, and lacking the warrior spirit or Yamato Damashi that defined the Japanese soldier. The assessment from Imperial General Headquarters was clear that they would break at the first sign of a determined, terrifying assault. Ichiki checked his watch and gave the order, unaware that in approximately 6 hours, 800 of his soldiers would be dead. He would be forced to burn his regimental colors in disgrace before taking his own life, and everything Japan thought it knew about the American fighting man was about to unravel. This is the story of the Guadalcanal campaign and how a small, isolated group of Marines shattered one of the most dangerous beliefs in military history. To understand the shock that awaited Colonel Ichiki at the Alligator Creek sandbar, one must first understand the mindset of the Imperial Japanese Army in 1942. For decades, Japanese military doctrine had been built on a concept of spiritual superiority, a mystical and foundational belief that the Japanese soldier possessed an indomitable will that could overcome any material disadvantage. While Western nations like the United States and Britain relied on machines, logistics, and overwhelming firepower, Japan relied on the seishin, or spirit. The roots of this belief stretched back to ancient mythology recorded in texts like the Kojiki, which described the Japanese people as descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu, making the emperor a living divinity and ensuring that a soldier fought for a sacred bloodline stretching back thousands of years. This philosophy was hardened into military science during the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, where a smaller Asian nation stunned the world by defeating a major European power, teaching Tokyo the dangerous lesson that spirit triumphs over steel and will defeats weapons. By the 1930s, this belief had become dogma, and Japanese officers were taught that Western soldiers were spiritually hollow traders and businessmen who prioritized individual comfort over collective sacrifice. The assumption was that if you pushed an American unit hard enough with a night attack involving bayonets and swords, they would crumble, surrender, or run. The early months of the Pacific War seemed to validate this arrogance completely, as American and Filipino defenders collapsed in the Philippines, the fortress of Corregidor fell, and tens of thousands surrendered in Bataan. At Singapore, 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered to a Japanese force half their size, and similar patterns repeated in the Dutch East Indies, Hong Kong, and Burma. Japanese high command drew the conclusion that the Americans were exactly what the intelligence said they were, well-equipped but lacking the will to fight. This belief was about to be tested by Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive of the war targeting an obscure, pestilence-ridden island in the British Solomon Islands chain called Guadalcanal. Intelligence had spotted the Japanese building an airfield there that could sever supply lines between the United States and Australia, so the mission fell to the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Vandegrift. Vandegrift, a 54-year-old veteran of the Banana Wars, had been promised 6 months to train his division, but was given 3 weeks when the order came down. His division was scattered across the Pacific, his equipment was still on docks in New Zealand, he had no accurate maps, and the rehearsal landing in Fiji was a chaotic disaster. Despite the chaos, on August 7, 1942, 11,000 Marines landed on Guadalcanal and the nearby islands of Tulagi and Florida, and to their shock, the landings were unopposed as the Japanese construction workers fled into the jungle. By the night of August 8th, the Marines had secured the airfield, naming it Henderson Field, but then disaster struck. On the night of August 8th, a Japanese naval task force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa surprised the Allied fleet in the Battle of Savo Island, sinking 4 Allied heavy cruisers and killing over 1,000 sailors in one of the worst naval defeats in American history. Fearing the loss of his aircraft carriers, the American naval commander, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, ordered the fleet to withdraw, taking the half-unloaded transport ships with him. The Marines were abandoned, standing on the beach watching their support vanish over the horizon, leaving them with limited ammunition, 30 days of rations, no heavy equipment, and no way off the island. They were alone. 11,000 men trapped on a hostile island, knowing that the Japanese Empire was coming to kill them. General Vandegrift established a defensive perimeter around the airfield, and the Marines dug in, scavenged captured Japanese rice, and waited for the inevitable counterattack. The Japanese response was swift, but Imperial General Headquarters fatally underestimated the number of Americans on the island, believing there perhaps only be 2,000 ashore. They sent Colonel Ichiki and his detachment of roughly 900 men to wipe them out. Ichiki landed at Taivu Point on the night of August 18 and, fueled by the arrogance of pre-war doctrine, ignored his orders to wait for the rest of his regiment. However, the Marines had a secret weapon in a native scout named Jacob Vuza, a retired sergeant of the British Solomon Islands Constabulary. Captured by Ichiki's men who found an American flag in his loincloth, Vuza refused to reveal Marine positions, even after being tied to a tree and stabbed 7 times in the chest and throat. Vuza survived, chewed through his bindings, and crawled 3 miles through the jungle to warn the Marines that hundreds of Japanese were coming. Forewarned, the Marines at the mouth of the Ilu River, misidentified as the Tenaru, reinforced their lines with barbed wire and 30-caliber water-cooled machine guns. When the Japanese charged at 01:30 a.m. on August 21st, screaming "Banzai," expecting the Americans to panic, the Marines did not run. The darkness erupted with the muzzle flashes of American weaponry, and the 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister shot turned the sandbar into a slaughterhouse, while machine guns cut scythe-like paths through the Japanese ranks. Ichiki watched in horror as his men were slaughtered by an enemy that held its fire discipline perfectly. By the afternoon, nearly 800 of Ichiki's men were dead. The Marines had lost just 35 men, and Colonel Ichiki committed ritual suicide in the aftermath of his failure. When the report reached Tokyo, the High Command refused to believe that one Japanese regiment had been destroyed by Americans and concluded that Ichiki simply had bad luck, so they doubled down and sent the Kawaguchi Brigade, commanded by Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. Kawaguchi realized that a frontal assault was suicide and planned to march his 6,000 men through the dense, uncharted jungle south of the airfield to attack the Marine perimeter from the rear. The march was a nightmare through a green hell of rot and impassable terrain that left the soldiers exhausted and starving by the time they reached their assembly areas. Waiting for them on a grassy ridge just south of the airfield was Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson and his elite Raider Battalion. Edson, known as Red Mike, sensed that the ridge was the key to the airfield and told his men they had to hold the spot. On the night of September 12th, the Battle of Edson's Ridge began with wave after wave of Japanese attacks. The fighting was hand-to-hand, with Marines using knives and rifle butts in the confusion of the night, and while the lines wavered, Edson stood tall on the ridgeline, exposed to enemy fire, rallying his men and refusing to surrender an inch.
The deciding factor was the artillery.
When the Japanese charged at 01:30 a.m. on August 21st, screaming "Banzai," expecting the Americans to panic, the Marines did not run. The darkness erupted with the muzzle flashes of American weaponry, and the 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister shot turned the sandbar into a slaughterhouse, while machine guns cut scythe-like paths through the Japanese ranks. Ichiki watched in horror as his men were slaughtered by an enemy that held its fire discipline perfectly. By the afternoon, nearly 800 of Ichiki's men were dead. The Marines had lost just 35 men, and Colonel Ichiki committed ritual suicide in the aftermath of his failure. When the report reached Tokyo, the High Command refused to believe that one Japanese regiment had been destroyed by Americans and concluded that Ichiki simply had bad luck, so they doubled down and sent the Kawaguchi Brigade, commanded by Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. Kawaguchi realized that a frontal assault was suicide and planned to march his 6,000 men through the dense, uncharted jungle south of the airfield to attack the Marine perimeter from the rear. The march was a nightmare through a green hell of rot and impassable terrain that left the soldiers exhausted and starving by the time they reached their assembly areas. Waiting for them on a grassy ridge just south of the airfield was Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson and his elite Raider Battalion. Edson, known as Red Mike, sensed that the ridge was the key to the airfield and told his men they had to hold the spot. On the night of September 12th, the Battle of Edson's Ridge began with wave after wave of Japanese attacks. The fighting was hand-to-hand, with Marines using knives and rifle butts in the confusion of the night, and while the lines wavered, Edson stood tall on the ridgeline, exposed to enemy fire, rallying his men and refusing to surrender an inch. The deciding factor was the artillery strikes from the 11th Marines that landed dangerously close to their own lines to shred the Japanese formations. By dawn on September 14th, the ridge was covered in corpses. Kawaguchi had lost over 600 killed, and the attack had failed. Tokyo was now in a panic as the American problem persisted, so they decided to commit the heavyweights by sending Lieutenant General Hyakutake and the 2nd Division, the famous Sendai Division, to the island. They brought over 20,000 troops and planned a massive, coordinated assault for late October. Hyakutake was so confident that his staff planned the surrender ceremony before the battle even began. On the night of October 24th, the Sendai Division struck the southern line, where the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, was digging in. Manning 2 heavy machine gun sections within that line was Sergeant John Basilone, an Italian-American from New Jersey who had joined the Marines because the Army wasn't tough enough. That night, the Japanese attacked Basilone's position with 3,000 men, and the jungle exploded with grenades and satchel charges. Basilone's machine guns fired so continuously that the barrels glowed red, and when his men were killed, he manned the guns himself, clearing jams in the pitch blackness and running through fire-swept jungle to retrieve ammunition. At one point, the pile of Japanese bodies was so high it blocked his field of fire, forcing him to run out amidst the attack to knock over the wall of corpses. For 3 days, the Sendai Division threw itself against the Marine lines and was butchered, broken against a wall of American lead and resolve. When Chesty Puller later asked a prisoner why they didn't maneuver to a weak spot, the prisoner replied that it was not the Japanese way to change a plan once it was written. By November and December 1942, the roles had reversed, and the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal began to rot on what they renamed Gato, or Starvation Island. The Japanese Navy could no longer supply them due to the Cactus Air Force dominating the daylight hours, and the Tokyo Express destroyer runs at night could not bring enough food. Japanese soldiers ate roots and bootlaces, while malaria and dysentery ravaged their bodies, reducing the once proud soldiers of the emperor to walking skeletons who developed a grim metric to predict death based on whether a man could stand, sit, or speak. Meanwhile, the Marines were getting stronger as the American Mani Division and the 2nd Marine Division arrived to relieve Vandegrift's exhausted men. General Hyakutake finally sent a message to Tokyo requesting permission to break into enemy positions and die an honorable death rather than perish from hunger.
Japan finally accepted defeat and executed Operation K in early February 1943, evacuating about 10,000 surviving troops but leaving behind over 20,000 dead. A staggering loss where for every one American killed, Japan lost 10 men. Major General Kawaguchi later called Guadalcanal the graveyard of the Japanese army, not just for the men who died, but for the death of their confidence. The battle was the turning point of the Pacific War on land because it shattered the delusion that Americans were soft. The Japanese learned that the American Marine was a terrifying adversary who would fight with savagery, and that American industrial power could sustain an airfield in the jungle while the Japanese Navy could not feed its own men. Today, the jungle has reclaimed the foxholes on Bloody Ridge, but the legacy remains etched into history. The 1st Marine Division still wears the word Guadalcanal on their shoulder patch, and men like Basilone, Edson, and Vandegrift became legends. The true significance of Guadalcanal was the psychological victory that proved the totalitarian belief in spiritual superiority was a lie, and that free men fighting for democracy could endure the worst hell imaginable and refuse to break. At 06:15 hours on that August morning, Colonel Ichiki thought he was looking at a group of soft boys, but he was wrong. He was looking at the force that would eventually burn his empire to the ground. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video, as it helps share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories, because each one matters and deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you, so leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts, and you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.